Hello, everybody. I'm Kevin Ressler, President and CEO of United Way, and occasional rabble-rouser and ne'er-do-well. So I'm last, right? Probably because I'm a former actor, sometimes politician, and occasional preacher. So we're ahead of schedule. This is going to be fun. But that's why you got written Kevin instead of ad-lib Kevin. So I'm going to start here. By show of hands, how many of you know exactly where your clothes that you're wearing came from? And I don't mean which store you bought from. I mean, where was your shirt manufactured? And further back from that, where were the materials sourced? See, a separate but equally important question is, do you know what materials your clothes are even made of tonight? Is it purely organic materials? And I don't mean organic farming processes, I mean natural fibers. Or are you wearing oil? I mean, surely you understand when you see polyester, when you see nylon, you're literally wearing a paper or a plastic bag on your back. Now, I know tonight we're talking about climate change, the impacts of our choices, actions on the world's ecological health, but my task is to speak a little bit wider than that, covering the question of equity with regards to climate change and human-influenced ecological disruption and destruction. But there are as many ways to talk about that as there are issues with climate change. Beginning here with clothing material doesn't really talk about the human ethics beyond the materials. Our textile industry over the last century and a half increasingly has been aggressively moved from our shores to foreign lands. The precipitating factor of this is the United States intracontinental war, intentionally chosen not to say civil war, intracontinental war brought on by some states attempting to secede from the Union in order to protect their ability to profit from human labor. But let us not let the North off the hook, because they were the demand for the products of that human capital. Remember, most of the southern states were dependent upon agriculture, profitable at the rates they were only because of enslaved human labor. When the labor force was removed, many U.S. farmers moved to other areas in the Caribbean. In fact, Brazil recruited United States farmers to go and continue to practice slavery in that country. What happened in America is we continued to oppress black farmers, first through sharecropping, and then through prison lease programs, both of which effectively continued the institutions of slavery beyond ownership of people as property. But in effectively freezing their mobility and agency, they remained essentially immobilized slaves. At the same time, America entered the Industrial Revolution and began to mechanize slavery. As we moved from man to machine, we could begin offloading many processes to other nations. While we continue to have textile mills and factories, our battles between unions and management often left out or continued to disadvantage various minority demographic populations. Other countries became bigger players in these processes, undercut wages until you fast forward into the 1980s and the 1990s when America begins the process of free trade zone arrangements with other countries. Aggressively and structurally, this supported and codified slave processes that we know as sweatshops, which most of our clothes were made in. But why this history lesson about slavery and clothing? Well, I want you to understand the very significance of the intertwining of all of these things. These are not independent. Climate change, racial justice, LGBT rights, disability work is all intertwined. You cannot have one without the other. But more specifically, your clothing is a continued contributor to global inequity in order to benefit wealthy empire nations, which, that's us. Why? So we can have $5 pairs of underwear. Whole systems are created of iniquity so we can have $5 pairs of underwear. And here's the kicker for climate change. While the solid numbers are hard to know, it is estimated that 2 to 10% of global emissions are a result of the clothing sector. Of that amount, only 1% is distribution. which when you think about how we usually talk about these things, is where we would talk about the problem, the supply chain and the transportation and all of that. Only 1% of the climate impact is distribution. Well, great, I gave you a solution, buy less shit, particularly less underwear. But I was asked to speak on equity, not to speak on emission solutions or clothing or even the lasting and continuing vestiges of slavery. So what does this all have to do with equity and climate change? Again, kind of everything. Think about everything I just said and think about how significantly interconnected it all is. Our clothes today are still connected to decisions made hundreds of years ago to enslave people. And our inability when slavery ended nationally to end our thirst for consumption. In fact, after World War II, our economy was intentionally designed around consumption, thus increasing the need to create. It requires significant mechanized agro-farming, wiping of rainforests, particularly in the Amazon, heating the earth, congesting transportation. These components all increase warfare for silicon, primarily in the Congo and other African nations. All these lead to continual warming, which leads to increased sea levels rising, which is the greatest human impact on island nations and coastal areas where it not only disrupts your beach vacation, but fisheries and other coastal labor. And who gets disproportionately impacted by such things? The poor who work the fishing boats, the poor who live in mineral conflict war zones, the poor who work disproportionately in the fields, the poor who are least able to weather the increased costs of relocation from their homes, ancestral or otherwise, or modernizing them to weather changes, the poor who are most likely to work and live in the shadows of institutions that pollute their groundwater and their rivers and poison their children. Now, I know it's pretty depressing to end this wonderful event this way. Sorry, kinda, not really. The thing is, if you stop buying those clothes, 99% of the problem from that item disappears. If we just make them more locally, you only solve 1%. We have to stop being so small-minded to think that we can make quick changes at the last minute to solve these monumental and existential crises. If I wrap this up in a bow for you, leave you feeling like it's all in hand, when it isn't, you're not going to do anything. You need to make significant changes in the way that you live, vote, worship, play, socialize, talk, think, and of course, act. And we need to stop denying the overwhelming significance of our blindness brought on by our privilege. I learned my own privilege pretty significantly when I was doing AmeriCorps Vista. I managed to buy a house in a historically low-income neighborhood in the city. The street was on the upswing, but the price was still low. Many of my neighbors were stable and comfortable homeowners like me. Like me, many had houses that had been updated. Mine had replacement windows and central air when I bought it. But there was one house across the street. It was always slumlorded out. And I was walking one day in the dead of winter when I noticed their windows had all these cartoon characters. And I thought that they were curtains until I realized that they were blankets insulating the windows, that I could see holes going in through. And it took me days to realize that, because I didn't have that narrative in my own life. And it struck me that the children in those homes, studying at night in the cold, were already beginning at a disadvantage of their classmates who had more environmentally comfortable housing. Fast forward a few years, that house was vacant, but the slumlord still owned it. Now I'd moved 3 doors down and I rented out the old house. And the landlord comes and sees me putting in some tile. And he says to me, why are you putting in such nice materials? You know the people who live down here. He doesn't know I live down there. You know the people who live down here. They don't care. They'll destroy your property. And I said, I find it fascinating that you put crap into your house and expect them to care more about it than you do. And he says to me, well, you know, these Puerto Ricans, that's what he said, these Puerto Ricans who live down here, they all just live off the government on their Section 8 vouchers. And I said to him, sir, they're a pass-through. You live on the Section 8 voucher. You are retiring on the Section 8 voucher. You are building equity on the Section 8 voucher, not them. My point is this. Those of us who have much more influence and power than those who have less have a responsibility to carry more of the cost burden in making our decisions and the practices that we choose to formalize as acceptable. Why? Because that's the difference between equity and equality. If we're going to solve these monumental challenges, then those with disproportionately higher resources are going to have to disproportionately bear more of the burden of solutions. And before you say it's unfair, I offer you this trade. Trade places with those who are disproportionately impacted. No one in this room will take that deal. The cost is that equity is not equality. And so think of this. Imagine a table. And imagine that there's a bunch of people at that table. And there's two individuals at that table who are the hosts. And the table's full of food, and they talk, and they welcome everyone. And before they begin, they take the plates, and they put food on their plates, so full that there's nothing left in the middle of the table for everyone else. They eat all of the food that they can until they are uncomfortable. And then they scrape the remaining food back onto the plates in the middle. And they say to their guests, "Welcome to the table and dine on our abundance. Aren't you so glad we gave back?" I hope that in 20 years, we're no longer saying that it's okay to give back of our abundance at the end of our life. But instead, we ask the question, why did you take so much to begin with as you went along the way? Thank you for allowing me to go way over my time.